Hi, everybody. As you get in, we have a little icebreaker question that you can answer a little bit before we start. We'll give it a few minutes for people to join. But welcome, everyone. I'm Samadi Thomas. I'm an analyst here at Change Research. I'm really glad that everyone is able to join us today. Have a great, informative webinar today by some of my colleagues, which I'll introduce in a moment. I guess before we get started, we do have just some quick housekeeping. Um, Melanie, can you get to the next slide? Yeah, so this session is being recorded. So if you miss anything or want to revisit this data, you'll be able to do that afterwards. We'll send an email with a link to the recording after the webinar. And if you have any questions as we go, please use the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar. We'll have a dedicated Q&A segment towards the end, but feel free to drop your questions throughout, and we'll get to as many as we can. We'll get to the next slide. So, what are the results of our little icebreaker? If you haven't already, go ahead and answer the icebreaker poll question that we have up. Just what does America being strong in the world mean to you? But let's look at what the results are here. We see that a little bit over half say alliances and diplomacy. A few of you also say a nation that picks its battles wisely, and economic influence and trade are things that define us being strong in the world. So just really interesting to keep in mind as we go through this data. But before we get into everything, let me introduce a little of who is here today. We have Mike Greenfield, who is our co-founder and CEO. He co-founded Change Research in 2017 with the goal of making quality polling actually accessible. He will not be joining the conversation today, but those that will be leading us through this data will be Melanie Phillips, who is head of our analyst team and brings both a serious academic rigor and real political instinct to everything that she does. And Stephen Claremont, who heads up our polling and is the person responsible for a lot of our methodological integrity and behind a lot of the data that you'll see today. And I'm Samadi Thomas. I'm an analyst here at Change. But we'll get into it, and I'll pass it to Melanie to go deeper into the findings.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marty. Welcome all y'all. I appreciate y'all being here. Today we're primarily going to be looking at the results of two separate polls, both of which were conducted nationally with registered voters. The first between March 8th and March 12th, and the second most recently between April 3rd and 7th, April 3rd and April 7th. We recruit through our dynamic online sampling, which means we meet voters where they're at, which is usually on social media platforms or through texting or through digital ways, and we find that that is a highly accurate measure. We do post-stratification or weighting on age, gender, race, ethnicity, region, education, urbanicity, and 2024 vote choice. And for this poll, the modeled margin of error is 2.6 percentage points on the first poll and 2 percentage points on the second poll. Sometimes, however, on the second poll, we didn't show all of the questions to all the respondents, so that does mean the sample sometimes goes up, and that would increase the margin of error to about 4%, and we'll flag that when that comes up. So, an agenda for today. What are the questions we're answering? What is this data really telling us? We're going to look about what Americans mean when they say they want a strong country. This connects to the question we asked in the introduction. And what I find really interesting is we in this panel and in this Zoom call represent one side of a very big split that we're seeing in American politics. But a consensus is this underlining that America is meant to be a strong country, and that is what most voters think. We're going to look at the Iran conflict as like a litmus test almost to look at how foreign policy is being reacted to in a very polarized society. So, who backs the action, who doesn't, and where is support already cracking? Because it's cracking a base. And what moves Trump supporters? So, when looking at this fracturing base, we're going to really deep dive in what moves supporters. In the Compass poll, we also did an equal battery on opposition and what moves opposers. We try to be as balanced on both sides. And if you're interested in that Compass poll data, you can sign up for the Compass poll. I'm sure Sumati can put a link in the chat, and you can get access to our monthly polling in that data well in our portal. So, we're going to look at the messages that create doubt among the base and which audiences are most persuadable. We'll then open up for Q&A and take your questions, and we'd love to hear from you. So I like to give the main points away in the beginning. So looking at the key takeaways, strength is one thing everyone agrees on. Nearly 8 in 10 Americans say it's important for the US to be viewed as the world's most powerful nation, and that holds across partisan lines. I almost never get to say nearly 8 in 10 Americans agree on anything anymore. And so it's really important to understand this foundation of an American ethos. But the unity almost ends exclusively there. And we see MAGA Republicans defining strength through almost exclusively military and economic dominance. We did not agree that much in our icebreaker poll. Whereas we can see Democrats are more through a shared vision of leadership. And so looking at this idea of what America's supposed to be and what most Americans agree on, it's very interesting to see how it plays out. We can also look as, yes, and it is being recorded. So we're all also looking at foreign policy as an echo chamber. What is really fascinating about this time in an almost eerie way is this is one of the first conflicts where we've got American actors engaging in a conflict in this way that is fully playing out in a social media echo chamber, right? We have very few briefings and very little information that isn't going through a partisan lens. And so how voters are responding to this foreign policy almost has less to do with the policy itself and more to the partisan media, or at least that is what we take and we think we're seeing in the data. What is what I think when Steve and I were going through the crosstabs that almost inspired this whole thing is the massive separation between MAGA Republicans and the rest of the GOP base. So foreign policy is where we think the Republican coalition is starting to fracture, right? MAGA Republicans are a wall. They're 90 plus on most of these measures, but non-MAGA Republicans have big gaps between the base. And we're also, and I think many people who are in the political world right now are fascinated with what's happening with young men. So young women overwhelmingly net opposed, but young men are also underwater on a lot of these things. And they're not in line with a lot of the older Republicans, especially even when we look at just young men who were Trump voters. Again, we're getting into smaller samples there, but something that I think to agree on. And so we're going to take you through a lot of this data. So I think the first thing we want to flag and how we're really conceptualizing this is that this is the first war fought in an echo chamber. We have Lego meme battles happening between countries, and we have very little actually on the ground coverage that's not going through any partisan lensings, right? We know regular Pentagon briefings, and so social media is largely filling this vacuum. We're getting most of the updates through Truth Social posts through the president, and we're getting algorithm-driven content that has massive partisan filters that is replacing verified reporting. So the result, it's almost like this foreign policy moment is an ink blot rather than an actual response. People are not responding to the conflict, they're responding to their own reflection of it. And where I think it is important is where is that ink blot holding and where is it not? And I think it's where it's not is where we really want to dig in, because when that partisan filter is no longer strong enough to truly split the divide, I think is where we're seeing some movement and some reaction to real policy. So, we're going to talk about a couple key segments that I want to define here before we jump on into it. We look a lot at independents. They're about 13% of the sample. They oppose the conflict, and their net approval of Trump is minus 56. We still measure net approval, despite some of our colleagues no longer measuring net approval in the space, but we measure Trump favorability every month in multiple ways, and that's available in the Compass poll data. So they're most persuadable on economic pain and safety messaging. We're looking at young voters. This is 24% of our sample, so a very good chunk, and they oppose the conflict by large majorities, and they are most motivated by the issues with cost of living. We segment out MAGA Republicans from non-MAGA Republicans. This is self-identification, and it's about 22% of the sample. And non-MAGA Republicans are about 14% of the sample. So those are key segments that I wanted to define before we jump on into it. So let's start at looking at foreign policy and the public support and where it fractures. So most Americans agree that America needs to be a hegemon. By hegemon, I mean a singular key leader, almost the only leader in many definitions. So we ask, how important do you think it is for America to be viewed as the most powerful nation on earth? 78% of Americans believe that's true. Again, if you're working in data right now, 78% of Americans believing anything is true besides that cost of living is an issue is overwhelming. And when we cross and we look into it, it's strongly held among Republicans and very strongly held across MAGA and non-MAGA Republicans, but it's also a majority of Democrats and independents. So we're starting with this foundation of agreement, right? This foundation that America needs to be an important, powerful figure. But from there, we fracture a bit. So this is not a new trend. We see similar trends in 2023. So we asked this question, to what extent do you think America should provide international leadership and engage with world issues on a 0 to 10 scale? Luckily, Stephen did this measure in 2023, so we're able to have a really good comparison point. The numbers are pretty similar. So in 2023, all voters, about 52% think that it should engage and lead, 51% of voters now. This is still in the majorities in Democrats to Republicans and is stronger among older age cohorts than younger age cohorts. But this, again, is not the massive divides that we see. I think independents stand out in a way that makes sense for their ideology, and they are in more of the less engagement territory. So America needs to be a hegemon and needs to take international leadership in key issues. But what does that leadership look like? So there's a lot of data on this page. Let me walk through it. So we asked, what kind of leadership role should America play in the world? And so we have the single world leader in the first column. About 20% of MAGA Republicans say that, about 16% of Republicans, but really largely driven by more of the far right side of the Republican GOP. And then on the middle, it's the equal role, right? It should be, sorry, the middle is the most active role. And this is where we can see that there's still a small majority, a small minorities across all of the key groups, but we see that it gets closer to that among MAGA Republicans and Republicans. Here in the dark blue, we have 71% of Democrats that believe it should play a shared leadership role, and this is about 51% of voters. So we are sitting in a foreign policy ideology that says America should be a hegemon, it should take leadership and engage at a big level. What that looks like starts to fumble and starts to get more partisan as we look about what that means, but still there's this active agreement that it should be a key player. And so we were interested in what this means to be a key player. And so one of the ways we thought about going about this, and curious to hear what people think in the Q&A, is how can we use world leader favorability as almost a proxy for how foreign policy is being interpreted, or as a partisan foreign policy view. And this is my first indicator, and I think me and Stephen saw this as foreign policy is going through a massive partisan filter. So what we have here is net favorability. Net favorability takes strongly or somewhat favorable minus somewhat unfavorable, strongly unfavorable. So if it's a positive number, favorable. If it's a negative number, unfavorable. So what we can see here is Dems are very, very positive on Canada, positive on France, generally positive on Germany and the United Kingdom. It's almost the exact opposite on the Republican side. So MAGA, 71% net unfavorable on Canada, 69 on France, 64 on the United Kingdom. We put the leaders' names here. I will flag that I think people are responding to the country more than the leader. But what I want to show here is that the MAGA GOP is already diverging or is already more activated by these partisan filters that we're seeing play out on the foreign policy stage. The president is making very clear who are his friends and who are not his friends in this space, and we're seeing this play out. But we think it gets even more interesting when we look at the more potentially what you would call non-democratic actors or the less of our allies. So here we can see that most of the partisan world agrees that these are not net favorables, right? These are not people that we feel strongly favorable for, except for MAGA GOP when it looks to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And so this to me, I think is a really fascinating and potentially a canary saying that the MAGA base foreign policy or interpretations is just a direct reflection of the leader of their base. And so the President Trump. And so this stands out. I mean, you can't look at a figure like this and think it doesn't stand out like this. So we really think that we're getting a very strong partisan filter, but it's not holding outside of his base. So we see non-MAGA Republicans net favorability in the negative. What I will flag, I do think it's interesting, net favorability for Russia is in the negatives across the board. So I think there's a bit of a narrative that the GOP or Trump is allied or has a friendly relationship with Vladimir Putin. It's not holding out in the numbers. So potentially some interesting data to dig in on there. We also see then where things diverge, right? Zelensky is far more popular with Dems than with Republicans, versus Israel is far more popular with Republicans. Interestingly enough, as JD Vance is currently in Hungary, or I believe was just in Hungary, um, net positive favorability among Republicans and non-MAGA Republicans, but there's a massive gap on positive favorability on Israel when we look at MAGA and non-MAGA Republicans. So potentially, this makes me, I write these surveys. So next time, I think we might want to ask Democrats to identify in the same way between progressive and non-progressive and see if the gap in the Democratic Party is just as wide. So stay tuned for future data. So that leads to views on American strengths and the leaders who represent it. So that's the section we just did. My two intro slides were flagged. And so what is important when we're looking at just the Iran conflict is this is not breaking the top 10. This to me seems surprising, but also not given how strong um, economics and government corruption have been. We collect this data every month, sometimes twice a month, on what is the biggest issue for you politically in the top three. Government corruption, inflation, are always in the high. Cost of healthcare and cost of housing and immigration flops because of the divergence amongst the partisan groups. So we're starting off with, despite the news coverage, despite the almost monumentous or era-defining moment this is in American history, it's not breaking the top 10 among most voters. But when we're looking at support or oppose, what is important to flag is it's also not moving much. So we had potentially anticipated that we'd see support maybe drop in April in comparison to March, but support remains pretty high. So do you support or oppose the U.S. taking military action against Iran? 41% of voters strongly support or somewhat support in March, and 44% strongly support or somewhat support in April. And this is despite, I mean, the economic cost and also the unknown casualties. We still don't, I think, have a clear picture of what the loss of life truly is in the conflict right now. And this data was collected and ended before the Tuesday announcement or anything of that nature to put in comparison. And this support or oppose is largely partisan. So Democrats 3% support, Republicans 85. Independents are under 30%, so more leaning towards the Democratic side here. But what I think is fascinating, and this first like crack in the base is what we'd call is Trump's young voters aren't sold. So the gap isn't only partisan, it's generational and it runs through the base itself. So on the right here, we have the support or oppose, and then we looked at it by age and gender, and then we looked at it by whether or not you're a young Trump voter or an older Trump voter. So overwhelmingly across the data, women are going to be more opposed to the conflict. This follows every essentially gender literature in the academic literature that we follow. They are usually more opposed to the conflict, and men are more supportive. But as you look that young men are diverging, specifically young Trump voters, because young Trump voters are overwhelmingly men, are diverging from their older base. So young women sit at just 13%, the lowest of any group by a large margin, and young men are at 35%. And then when we look just at young Trump voters, only 63%. Still the majority, but it is not in line with the older Trump voters at 88%. So the base is unified, the rest of the GOP is not, is what we're seeing, right? So MAGA Republicans overwhelmingly support the conflict. Inversion, a majority of non-MAGA Republicans are, but non-MAGA Republicans are 3 times more likely than MAGA Republicans to say the MAGA that the conflict has made them less safe. And this is data that we're going to go through in a second. So we're starting to see that there's not a unified base on the GOP on this issue in ways that we have not seen in other issues. So, what are the reasons, right? So, what are the differences in what people are seeing with this conflict? So, we asked in the military conflict with Iran, is America winning, losing, or neither winning nor losing? So, support could be following the scoreboard, but the truth is not everyone's seeing the same score. So, Republicans overwhelmingly think they're winning, but much smaller majority of non-MAGA Republicans think that. Democrats overwhelmingly think we are losing or neither winning nor losing. It's not fully balanced in the winning or losing. So 79% of Republicans think we're winning, but versus 45% of Democrats think they're losing. Again, age is a big thing here, right? 28% of 18 to 34-year-olds think we're winning versus 40% of 65 plus think we're winning. But everyone agrees that they see the impact on cost of living. So, I mean, all of us are currently filling up our gas tanks. I'm in California. I've never seen gas in the $8 figures before. But I think it's much cheaper to walk now. So how much that we asked, how much, if at all, do you think the U.S. military involvement overseas affects what you pay for gas and everyday goods? This to me is a good sanity check, right? Sometimes when you're looking at this data, you're like, are they just gonna say everything's good because they're Republican and Democrats are gonna say everything's bad because they are Democrats? This, and we're seeing a true measure, right? Overwhelming 59% say a lot. And then if we look across age groups, we see it in the high red. And we look across just Trump voters, we also see it in the high red, even across age groups. But despite this, the pain at the pump is shared. The economic verdict is not. So economically, has the US involvement in Iran been positive, negative, or neutral? And so what we see here is that nearly 50% of MAGA Republicans think it's been somewhat positive. I think this is the direct response of the non-fracturable core base, and only 15% of non-MAGA Republicans do. All voters, 44% negative. And so we still see that MAGA Republicans that seem to still be responding to the partisan filter in a way that potentially non-MAGA Republicans are breaking through. And the truth is, the younger you are, the more you feel it economically. So if we're looking at 18 to 34-year-olds, again, this is where we see the gender gap between women and men. 62% of young women say it's very negative versus 18 to 34-year-old men. But again, that's 76% of 18 to 34-year-old men who think the economic environment has been the economic impact has been very negative. And in an election that was just recently won, or I guess it's been it's not recently, that was won on a economic argument, this seems like a big potential fracture. And we see that this is most radical, the most extreme on it, the younger, and gets lower as you age. With some interesting notes about Gen X women that I'm sure we could dig into in the Compass poll. And then if we are looking then at just comparing Democratic men to Democratic women and Republican men to Republican women, we can see that the balance is still flipped, but again, not that extreme. So looking at 18 to 29-year-old Republican men, 45% think it's going to be super neutral versus 18 to 29% of Republican women, 83%. So gender is playing a big role here on how this is interpreted and is very important when we're looking across this data. So again, maybe it's not cost, but maybe it's safety, right? There's disagreements on whether this makes the USA safer. So non-MAGA Republicans aren't buying the economic upside in the way that the safety is being brought out. So if the America continues the military action in Iran over the next a few months, do you think America will be safer, less safe, no more or no less safe, and not sure? So Republicans, 67% think it's going to make them safer versus 76% of Democrats think it's less safe. But again, big gap between MAGA Republicans and non-MAGA Republicans. So non-MAGA Republicans, only 48 say that it's going to make the US safer. So again, all these are potential mechanisms or levers, I'm not saying causally, but that could be trying to explain the gap between non-MAGA support and MAGA support. So we're going to look then a little bit at the pressure points. So understanding support and the path to moving the needle. And I'm going to hand this over to Stephen, who did all the analysis on the open-ended qualitative data.
Thanks, Melanie. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Claremont. I'm head of polling and at Change Research. And I wanted to sort of approach like looking at what messages can work and not work really from the beginning. I've seen a lot of memos that come through of complicated statistical procedures to compare one message to another among large groups of voters. And I wanted to sort of, I think what we want to do, particularly going forward now that we have better tools to analyze open-ended data, is to ask more open-ended questions and start from the framework of what are the themes people are talking about, what are the language that they're using, and analyze that and then use that to build messages. So we asked people opposed to the war why they're opposed to the war. That's what we're looking at here. We also asked supporters of the war what concerns that you have. And the reasons for opposition are there are a lot of them, and they're not sort of solely economic. The main one is that the war is illegal and unconstitutional, falls through with Trump and dislike of Trump and the way that he operates. Iran not being an imminent threat, the war serving Israel's interests, not America's, which the story that Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan published the other day from their book. It's nice of them to let us know before June these big stories so we can actually see them in the paper before the book. But Benjamin Netanyahu and his top aides were in the Situation Room directly making the case to the president. The war being a distraction from the Epstein files, no plan, no objectives, no exit strategy. Go to the next slide. Diplomacy never tried. The nuclear deal was abandoned. The economic harm to Americans. It's not, for the opposition, it's one of the reasons they're opposed to it. It's not central. Loss of human life, both American and Iranian civilians, and repeating historical mistakes in the Middle East from Afghanistan, Iraq, and then other failed wars in Vietnam, and the series of interventions that have been going on for, I think, most of our entire lives. More interesting, we wanted to probe doubts among supporters. So what is it that's actually going to move them and isolate that audience? And the themes that emerged the most was fear of a prolonged war, a forever war. One of my favorite quotes, if it lasts more than 5 weeks, the Lindsey Graham amnesties will have gotten us into another military industrial complex moneymaker. Really specific, and this is from someone who supports the invasion. Not finishing the job, leaving the mission incomplete, which is a common theme of what that is basic that has been fed by the right of why America hasn't won since World War II in these conflicts. It was that we didn't have the nerve to go all the way forward. That's a lot in Pete Hegseth's rhetoric right now. Loss of American military lives. Um, People frame it very personally, people that they know, relatives that they know, wanting people to come home. Um, Drawing a hard line on boots on the ground, which you can see in the actions of the president that he doesn't really mention this at all and explicitly rules it out and then sometimes rules it in, but it is something he is deathly afraid of. Sleeper cells and potential for domestic terrorism. If you go to the next slide. Rising gas and oil prices. Again, it is something that's there. It's not the central argument. Escalation into a larger or world war, a power vacuum when what comes after the regime. Some concern for innocent Israeli Iranian civilians. The bombing of the girls' school on the first day has really done incalculable damage to. It's one of the few things of real information that has gotten through the attempts to stifle it. Um, and then some supporters think that Democrats, the media, and liberal institutions will undermine the mission politically to fund it, spread propaganda, and force a premature withdrawal. So you can see sort of it runs the gamut of reasons that people concerns that they have, some that would be right for democratic messaging, and some that are not. And when we sort of go through this, it's like supporters, they run hot with very aggressive, combative energy directed at Iran. The opponents, the energy and emotions are directed at Trump, the administration, Netanyahu, and the decision itself. They use lots of emotions like anger, outrage, betrayal, moral disgust. Um, and the same thing, supporters use righteous anger, but towards a different group, which is Iran. Next one. Um, Supporters of the war, they definitely personalize it with support for President Trump, and the personalized nature of his leadership is one of the things that that resonates with the supporters of the U.S. involvement. Um, on the other hand, the opponents also very personalize it towards Trump and call him a liar, a moron, a fascist, idiot, someone acting out of ego or self-preservation. Um, and Hegseth is equally mocked as unqualified, with the implicit frame of the people in charge are incompetent or corrupt, and nothing they say can be believed. Supporters, when they talk about their concerns, they use very short, emotionally driven statements, just a word or two, none, escalation, gas prices, sleeper cells. When they elaborate, it's to express a visceral feeling rather than build a logical argument. And the concerns read like a stream of gut reactions. Opponents are much more argumentative and detailed. They have responses read like structured briefs, like saw in the data that came back, like bulleted lists of all the reasons people oppose the war. Um, and they tend to make very specific claims of why they oppose the war instead of talk about feelings and emotion. Um, Among supporters of the conflict, U.S. involvement in the conflict, Iran is overwhelmingly framed through the lens of a regime as a terrorist state, a theocracy, an existential enemy. The Iranian people are sometimes distinguished from their government, but many supporters dehumanize the regime entirely, bomb them back to the Stone Age, turn them into a parking lot. Some of the sentiments that have also been channeled through the president on his janky social media site. Opponents frame Iran as a sovereign nation that was not threatening the U.S. They they rarely express hostility towards Iran itself. See, some even express sympathy, not necessarily to the regime, but for the people. Um, they believe that the U.S. administration chose the war, and several specifically say that Iran didn't do anything to us. If supporters, when they talk about their concerns, they focus a lot on sleeper cells and they tie it to the Biden administration, that Biden's border policies let Iranian terrorists in the country who will now be activated. So you can sort of see if a terrorist attack does happen, They're already primed to blame Biden for it. And opponents talk a lot about the war being a distraction from the Epstein files, and that was entirely manufactured to distract from Trump's connection to Epstein. Supporters worry about primarily about Americans suffering, troops dying, gas prices rising, the war coming home via sleeper cells. They do talk about Iranian civilians, but they're usually framed as secondary or unfortunate collateral. The emotional center of gravity is that we're protecting our own. Opponents distribute their concern equally between American service members and Iranian civilians. They lead to the moral horror of killing innocent people abroad. And the emotional center of gravity is broader, suffering regardless of nationality, and the war producing no good outcomes for both sides. So we took from the March poll, we took these concerns and we framed them into messaging to see what will, using sort of that language, building from the language people gave us, messages to see what people respond to. And the numbers on the right are the percent saying how persuasive they find these messages. And the ones that came to the top were about sleeper cells and domestic attacks, um, of giving people the permission, that telling them that they're right to be concerned about sleeper cells and domestic attacks. I tweaked some of the language to use the phrase radical Islamist terrorism, the thing that supposedly we couldn't say 10 years ago, and we elected Trump because he could finally say it, or whatever nonsense they were saying. So frame it in their language with their right to be concerned. 52% found that persuasive as a reason to oppose the war. We framed it in terms of cost, but broader, like expensive, bloody, decade-long, um, definitely part that costs the American lives and taxpayer dollars with nothing to show for it. So it's brought not like you're paying more at the gas pump. It's like we're doing another thing like we've always been done before that are expensive and don't produce anything. Also got into explicitly America got stuck in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years. All the forever wars were promised that they would be quick, and every one of them drained lives and money for years. That is about the same as economic pain, which is about 40% found that persuasive. The least persuasive argument we tested was involved President Trump, and that he had 4 years, that he didn't do anything about this, about Iran when he was first president and chose not to take action. Um, that he's one of the, called every previous president a failure. He's one of those presidents. That's not an effective message. And the effective messages are going to be the ones that tie directly into people's anxiety and tell them that they're right to be anxious about it, and then reinforce it in language that they've been fed for multiple decades, particularly as it comes to Islamic terrorism. And you can see we split this up by MAGA and non-MAGA Republicans, supporters of the war, and there's pretty very little difference. Non-MAGA Republicans tend to respond a little bit more to the decade-long costs, um, while like both MAGA and non-MAGA really respond to the fear of domestic terrorism. And again, if they when it happens, many will blame Biden for it. The story is already primed, but it is something. Our goal is to raise anxiety about this, particularly as it goes on, which like kind of seems like it will, despite all the celebrating on Tuesday night for about 5 minutes. But that is really where we can peel off supporters from their support for the war. And I will hand back to Melanie to wrap up.
Thanks so much, Stephen. So what we're thinking strategic implications is that it's likely the winning perception is load bearing, meaning that if this shifts, it's likely that we will see at least non-MAGA Republicans shift further away from the MAGA Republican base, but also potentially that the MAGA Republican base will shift as well. The data shows support that could follow the scoreboard. It's the key thing is not everyone seeing the same score. So there's not been a direct translation of pain at the pump to pain for the economy overall. And truthfully, what we've seen across the last 6 months of data is that the economic realities are very different in partisan base, or at least what they're reporting them to be. Um, the sleeper cell and the domestic retaliation concern is the one argument that actually seems to penetrate the base. So 54% of MAGA supporters express concern about retaliation on American soil. And the key thing is, and I think this is everyone knows concerns about costs are high, are top issues, but costs are not moving this on this issue, right? We had arguments about the cost of Americans. That was not the biggest concern among supporters. And the forever war frame seems to be the most durable. Looking overall, we can see that the base only strategy has a ceiling, right? So MAGA consolidating behind Trump through the partisan lens and how it's operating on in response to foreign policy is real. It's there, but it's not growing, and in fact, it's likely shrinking. Everyone outside of that coalition, independents, non-MAGA, young voters, are moving in the other direction, or at least not solidifying or consolidating with the MAGA base. And as the foreign policy continues to play to this base, it's going to continue to isolate what is a non-winnable plurality. And it's that we are really looking at, right? And so that's why we look at young men and non-MAGA as potentially a canary for the backlash of this reinforcing cycle that President Trump has found himself in, right? The data showed that they were supposed to be a Republican growth opportunity. And yet, at 35% support for the conflict, they're already cooling. And if the economic pain persists and the conflict drags, there could be a further course correction among the first generation more conservative than the last. And lastly, foreign policy views can't be separated from the information ecosystem voters live in. We show how important it is to measure multiple ways of asking a question, right? Pain at the pump versus overall economy, and really seeing which ways allow for the partisan lens to shift a little bit. So ultimately, we're not fighting policy arguments here. We're fighting a curated reality of the news ecosystem that we're in. So that was a little bit about our polling. We're Change Research. Like Sumati said, we were founded in 2017 to democratize access to public opinion research. While you're getting in your Q&A questions, I'll tell you a little bit more about us. We are fast and we offer accurate on-the-ground polling using a tech-powered public opinion firm. It's what happens when you're founded by one of the first data scientists of LinkedIn. We're very tech empowered and we're able to get data at a very local level. And that's one of the things that makes me excited to be a researcher here. So thank you. If you want to learn more about our work, we also have our Compass Poll data, which is our monthly data in our portal. Our portal is an online platform that we just won a READ award for, which is super cool. So thanks to our tech team. And you can ask open-ended questions to our data and get responses on all the data that we're collecting every month. So I'm excited to see what Q&A. Sumati, I'll let you moderate and ask questions, and Steve and I will respond.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, we have a few questions here. One is from Thomas. He asks, can we expect, one third of 18 to 34 year old voters to turn out this November? One third was the sample that we had here. So just kind of your thoughts on the turnout for this group.
I'm seeing if Stephen will jump in, but I mean, I think we should expect high turnout in this election, especially among younger voters, especially among younger voters who are hitting the economic costs of this political environment the most. Whether it's one third or not, I'm not sure. But Stephen, what do you think?
I mean, we see in like the younger voters are the ones, so we track likelihood to vote using a 0 to 10 motivation question. So younger voters are the ones who like least likely to have their motivation level as a 10. But I think the question of that will ultimately be answered by how well the Democratic campaigns are at bringing out young voters and actually speaking to their concerns. It is one of the things that I'm concerned about because I've heard stories about the 2024 presidential campaign in some of the swing states basically abandoning youth turnout in 2024 and focusing on different groups instead. In theory, we should be able to do both persuasion and turnout, and particularly speak to the broad dissatisfaction that young voters have, particularly men have, about just about um, everything in public life. I will also say that probably definitely 18 to 34-year-old men are decidedly negative about the Democratic Party. So the message is really going to have the change message is going to have to be delivered from individual candidates making the strongest possible case that they are best able to deal with the future in a way that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration were not able to do, particularly for their needs. And their needs really are cost of housing, cost of living, cost of energy, all of that. But we have a massive credibility gap to make up that is going to be the challenge. So I think already they're probably primed to be the group, as they always are, the group to turn out the least. But it is really where the potential is, both for 2026 and long term, if we are able to effectively communicate in ways that we really haven't been for more than a decade.
Yeah, great
Um,
answer.
we have another question from Thomas. Is it fair to say, by and large, most issues are split along partisan lines and simply reflect the, Democratic versus Republican polarity, or is this a referendum on Trump approval, disapproval?
I mean, I would say a lot of issues are split on partisan, like a lot. That's why it's so fascinating when they're not right now. Um, and that's why I think this data stands out because the split is not fully partisan. And when you remove the MAGA base out, you actually see more traction. And when you look at certain questions on costs, you see that it's not partisan. Almost all the time when you mention Donald Trump, you get an immediate positive boost on the Republican side on any issue. But I do think that this is pushing the gaps or the fractures in the base further.
And I think that's one of the things you can see if when you get onto subscribe to our portal to look at all Compass poll data, because we ask a lot of questions. If Trump hasn't focused on an issue or focused on a person, then the data is a lot flatter. Like if you look at some of our polling on data centers or on certain types of renewable energy, not necessarily windmills, because Trump is psychotic about windmills because the Scottish government uh, like didn't cave into him when he didn't like the view from his golf course. So that's what we all have to pay for. But if it's not, you can see much flatter, not really differences. And I think the I was looking at a 2023 poll that I did when I asked these questions about world leaders, and then there was very little partisan difference on Mohammed bin Salman. And this time, now that he's been here and feted by Trump and much more clearly Trump aligned, you can see this split much more negative with Democrats, very much more positive with Republicans. When you look at Narendra Modi, which is there's a great ad you can find on YouTube of Trump that some Indian American group did to support Donald Trump, and he talks about how he'd be a great friend to Modi, and ends with Trump a jump cut where Trump's trying to say a Bicky Bar Trump Sarkar. It's a great ad, but he hasn't really feted Modi or talked about Modi, and you sort of look. There's no, it's sort of perceptions of him are very flat by party, and they are very no real difference from 2023. It really is like when Trump talks about an issue or an issue gets driven on Fox News and then all the other levels of conservative and MAGA media, it becomes very polarized because Democrats have the opposite reaction to it. But it is not true of everything until that happens. Cryptocurrency used to be the same way too, about 5 years ago. Now differences are much more polarized. But it is like it's affirmatively Trump has to focus on it to drive that shift in public opinion. It's not people need help in cues to sort of see where do I think I should be or where do I think Trump is going to go. They don't really get there on their own until Trump does it.
We have another question. Well, we have a question from Craig. But before I ask his question for him, do you want to also launch our questions for our attendees here. If y'all can answer that while our panelists here answer. But Craig asks, did you get data on which specific information sources are helping curate these different realities?
Yeah, so every poll we ask where people are getting their information from and their news from. I would say these are pretty sticky, meaning that we don't see much fluctuation. Young people are getting most of their news from YouTube. Majority of voters still say they're getting a lot of their news from local news sources. Question marks on what they mean by local news sources, and I think we could dig in more there. And so and then a lot of people are getting their news from the social media platform that matches their generation, meaning millennials and Gen X are on Facebook. Younger voters are on TikTok and Instagram, and so that's the case there.
And I would say it's like Republicans disproportionately say they get their news from Fox News.
Yep.
And we sort of haven't gone granular on podcasts, at least for this poll. But there's a little bit of that combined with various different online news sources.
Yeah.
And I will have noticed that when we've done a lot of IDIs, individual interviews with different voters, and when we get into news sources and what they trust, it's they you ask them, well, I'll see a news story, I'll hear about it, and then but I'm not necessarily going to believe it. And I check a variety of different sources. But those sources tend to be all from the same universe. And then they sort of overestimate the amount of research they actually do on a topic. But Fox generally still does drive Republicans in a way. It might not in the future as that fractures more and more people cut the cord on cable, but it still sort of drives the whole ecosystem. And local news, like Melanie is right, local news is the top news source. But that's something to monitor going forward after the Nexstar Sinclair merger and how, or Sinclair, whatever the big merger was among two outlets. Local news is going to feed more and more conservative talking points in a way that people are not necessarily going to recognize through the own filters that they put in their own minds. Right. Right.
Yeah, if you're really interested in this media data, in December, Sumati led an incredible poll that was just about media, news, content, anything like that. All of that data is accessible in the Compass poll in the Compass portal. So big deep dive there, and we think it's that I think that type of data is still pretty accurate, given that it was done in December. It doesn't move as fast.
We have another question here from Mary. She says, I understand from the messaging standpoint that retaliation messaging can create divisions, but without clear, immediate proof points, how do you communicate that in a way that doesn't come across as alarmist or speculative? Economic issues have clear hooks. People can see gas prices going up. What's a comparable hook in that sense?
I think it's going to have to be the messenger that delivers it. Um, I think it's someone who's not clearly identified as a political figure. Like if I was to create an ad, I would use like a mom of a service member, or a police a New York City police officer who was on the beat on 9/11, um, or who second generation from someone who was on the beat in 9/11. I think it's the it's the reassurance message is what is something that gets through people's filters. And usually what that is people rather than people are identified as political. I think for definitely talking points, uh, for groups that are political, the cost messaging does work with that. I think the escalation message will. But when we're trying to like persuade supporters away, it's trying to find the right, it's true of any campaign, the right person that does not code as someone who is intrinsically hostile to the war in Iran. It's similar to the most effective Obama ad in 2012 was an ad with a person who was tasked to build the stage for the event where Bain Capital bought their company and then immediately laid him off. So it is people that do not seem like someone that would be in a normal political ad.
Well, that's all the questions that we have. Thanks so much to everyone for joining our webinar today. We will send out a recording of the webinar, most likely later this afternoon. And in the meantime, if any questions pop up, feel free to shoot us an email at info@changeresearch.com. Also, if you want to learn more information, please fill out the exit poll, and we can get in contact with you. And again, we also put the link to sign up for our data portal in the chat if you would like to sign up there. It's free and it's a great resource to dive into lots of different topics that we tend to ask about in our Compass polls monthly. Thanks. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Thanks so much.
Bye.